Right, so Israel has long relied on its universities as much as its diplomats to project an image of respectability. Its academic institutions, particularly Technion, Tel Aviv University, and the Weizmann Institute of Science, or what's left of it after Iran struck it, have been celebrated as proof that Israel is a thriving liberal democracy at the cutting edge of science and technology, distinct from its neighbours in the Middle East. These universities have played a vital role in building Israel's brand as the startup nation, securing lucrative research partnerships and collaborations across Europe and North America. But all of that narrative is now increasingly under threat, and Israel, well, they've only got themselves to blame for it, haven't they? Across the world, universities are reassessing or severing their ties with Israeli institutions, citing their complicity in the occupation of Palestine and the war on Gaza. The University of Florence's decision this month to cut multiple partnerships with Israeli institutions has become emblematic of this shift. For once, one of these educational BDS stories getting some media attention. So often such news is being suppressed, you see. Academic boycotts as these are, despite the lack of coverage, they turn out to be a central and highly effective component of the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement, the BDS movement, second only in terms of effect to financial boycotts as it happens. They are undermining Israel's carefully cultivated global narratives, eroding its soft power and creating a long-term generational shift that threatens its international legitimacy, and as such, Israel's in a little bit of a flap over it. Right, so the University of Florence's decision to join the global academic boycott against Israel marks another turning point in Europe's intellectual climate. It follows on nicely from another video I've just made, actually, showing this also happening in Europe right now from a legal standpoint too. But earlier this month, 5 of its departments, the Mathematics and Computer Science, Engineering, Agricultural Sciences and Technology, Architecture and Political and Social Sciences departments, voted to sever existing partnerships with various Israeli academic institutions. Amongst those targeted were Ben Gurion University of the Negev, which is known for its military research, Ariel University, which is based in an illegal West Bank settlement, and Tel Aviv University's Blavatnik Interdisciplinary Cyber Research Center, which is closely tied to Israel's cyber intelligence apparatus. As IQ&A reported, this was not a piecemeal decision or an act of symbolic solidarity. These departments formally declared that their collaborations were incompatible with the university's ethical obligations, explicitly aligning themselves with the Palestinian campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel, or PACB, which is much easier to say. Italy has historically been a strong ally of Israel, of course, both diplomatically and academically, and Italian universities have generally resisted BDS measures previously, though this has certainly been shifting since the genocide of Gaza began and gradually worsened. In May of last year, for example, the University of Florence's Senate issued a cautious statement insisting on the need to preserve dialogue and academic freedom, arguing that intellectual exchange should be preserved even amid political disagreements. It's a polite way of putting a genocide, isn't it? Yet we come to the here and now just over a year later, and this position has now become untenable for them. Months of student encampments and petitions and faculty-led campaigns have made continuing business as usual impossible. According to Italian news outlet Domani, over 500 academics and students signed an open letter demanding that Florence cut ties with Israeli institutions involved in the war in Gaza and the occupation of the West Bank, framing their arguments explicitly within the BDS movement and PACB guidelines. The student movement dubbed itself an Intifada Studentesca, directly linking its actions to the broader Palestinian struggle. The University of Florence's decision is symbolically significant not just for Italy, but for Europe as a whole. Florence is one of Italy's most prestigious institutions, and its move signals a growing willingness amongst elite European universities to challenge Israel's narratives publicly. It also demonstrates that academic boycotts are no longer confined to grassroots activism. They are becoming institutionalized, with entire departments adopting them as formal policy. Florence's decision is part of a larger wave of academic boycotts sweeping Europe, North America, and beyond. In Belgium, Ghent University severed all academic ties with Israeli institutions in 2024, citing their complicity in human rights violations. In Spain, the University of Barcelona overwhelmingly voted to end collaboration with Israeli partners, arguing that academic cooperation could not continue with institutions directly involved in military research. The Netherlands has become a particular hotspot for academic BDS activism as it happens. Utrecht University, Radboud University, Nijmegen, Tilburg University and Erasmus University of Rotterdam have all suspended or terminated partnerships with Israeli universities, with others such as Wageningen University and Maastricht University initiating ethical reviews of their ties as well. North America, too, has witnessed growing academic resistance. At MIT, student activism forced the termination of the MIT Lockheed Martin Seed Fund, which involved collaboration with Israeli institutions. Portland State University and San Francisco State University divested from research partnerships with companies tied to the Israeli military, effectively cutting academic links. The University of Waterloo in Canada announced that it would review all its institutional collaborations with Israel under a new human rights framework. Even in the United States, where pro-Israel lobbying is the strongest, universities are beginning to face sustained pressure from student and faculty networks demanding academic disengagement. The Times of Israel has described these developments with alarm, as they would, noting that academic boycotts have risen by 66% globally across the years 2024 to 25, and warning that Israeli universities are gearing up to fight back against what they now openly call a strategic threat. What are you going to do then, guys? Deal with your insane government so this stops happening? No, you're just going to deploy more Zionist supporters to complain and campaign against these moves in the hope that the propaganda will win through again, aren't you? These are not isolated decisions, but part of a deliberate strategy. PACB has worked for years to build networks of academics and student activists who push for institutional boycotts, drawing inspiration from the anti-apartheid academic campaigns that helped delegitimize South Africa in the 70s and 80s. Academic boycotts matter in ways that go beyond symbolic protest. They attack Israel's soft power by undermining one of its most important global narratives, that it is a modern, democratic and intellectually advanced state, as opposed to a repressive and regressive, occupying white supremacist settler colonial project enacting apartheid. For decades, Israeli universities have been marketed as proof of Israel's enlightened and innovative character. International research partnerships, joint patents and academic exchanges reinforce the perception that Israel was a crucial partner for the West, not only militarily, but intellectually. Severing those ties reframes this narrative. Instead of being seen as centres of scientific excellence, Israeli universities are increasingly viewed as complicit in human rights violations. PACB has consistently argued that Israeli universities are not neutral academic institutions, but active participants in the oppression of Palestinians. Technion develops drones and military technology used in Gaza. Ben Gurion University collaborates with the Israeli military on security and surveillance systems. Ariel University's very existence violates international law, built in an illegal West Bank settlement as it is. Tel Aviv University's Cyber Research Center is closely tied to Israeli intelligence and the notorious Pegasus spyware. By targeting these institutions, academic boycotts expose how deeply enmeshed Israel's celebrated startup nation is in military occupation and apartheid policies. This reframing undermines another key Israeli talking point as well: academic freedom. Israel and its defenders have long argued that academic boycotts are attacks on intellectual freedom and open dialogue. Yet activists counter that it is Israel itself that systematically denies academic freedom to Palestinians. But of course they do that, don't they? Palestinian universities are regularly raided by Israeli forces. Students and faculty are arrested or harassed, and Gaza's higher education system has been totally crippled by the blockade and repeated military assaults, not least the genocide which has largely destroyed it. The academic boycott, therefore, is presented not as an attack on intellectual exchange, but as a moral obligation to stop collaborating with institutions that are themselves complicit in silencing Palestinian scholarship. The moral authority of universities also gives academic boycotts a unique weight. When elite intellectuals institutions cut ties, it sends a message that goes beyond politics and beyond media sound bites. It signals that Israel's actions are not just incontroversial, but they're morally indefensible. This mirrors the role academic boycotts played in the anti-apartheid movement. In South Africa, the refusal of Western universities to collaborate with apartheid-era institutions helped shift public opinion by framing the regime as the pariah that it was, unworthy of intellectual partnership. So perhaps the most significant aspect of academic boycotts is their long-term impact, therefore. Universities are not just sites of research, they're incubators for future political leaders, journalists and policymakers, the next generation of these. The students driving these campaigns today are going to be the people shaping public discourse tomorrow. As Domani noted in its reporting on Florence, the student movement in Italy reflects a generational shift in how young Europeans view Palestine. For many young people, solidarity with Palestinians is no longer a radical or a niche cause, it's now a moral imperative for them. Academic boycotts help normalise this position within mainstream intellectual culture for them. This generational shift could have profound political consequences for the future, and not in a good way for Israel. If students at elite universities continue to push for boycotts, governments will eventually feel the pressure to align policy with the moral consensus of their intellectual elites, just as they did in the South African case. It happened before. We've seen it happen before. We know that it works. In that sense, academic boycotts are not just acts of protest, they are investments in the future political climate. Israel's reaction to academic boycotts reveals just how seriously it takes the threat of that. The Israeli government has poured millions into anti-BDS initiatives, lobbying Western governments to criminalise or delegitimise the movement. It has pressured universities directly, warning that partnerships could be jeopardised if they endorse boycotts. Or better they cut the strings themselves first, isn't it? The Times of Israel, in that same article I mentioned a moment ago, has stated that Israeli universities are now establishing task forces to protect international collaborations. Well, that's a great use of educational funding, isn't it? Framing the academic boycott as an existential challenge to their international standing. Yet these counter-strategies often backfire. Heavy-handed attempts to suppress BDS, whether through anti-boycott laws or diplomatic pressure, draw more attention to the movement and reinforce the perception that Israel fears accountability, which, of course, it does. It just isn't used to it. It better get used to it. In Florence, student activists cited Israel's global campaign against BDS as proof that academic boycotts were effective and therefore necessary, and they're right. The more Israel pushes back, the more it confirms the movement's strategic importance. The academic boycott also raises important legal and ethical questions that give it further weight than already outlined. Under international law, collaborating with institutions located in occupied territories, such as Ariel University, arguably violates UN Security Council Resolution 2334, which declares Israeli settlements illegal. That university is, in and of itself, illegal. Some legal scholars argue that universities continuing such partnerships, therefore, could in future face legal challenges under universal jurisdiction laws, particularly in European countries that have prosecuted war crimes before on this basis. Just look at what Belgium has recently done with those 2 Israeli soldiers. Ethically, the debate often revolves around whether academic freedom should trump complicity in human rights violations. Opponents of boycotts argue that universities should remain neutral spaces of dialogue. Boycott advocates respond that neutrality in the face of oppression is itself a political choice, and it is, and that refusing to boycott amounts to legitimising Israeli apartheid. I would agree with that. This moral framing strengthens the boycott's intellectual credibility by positioning it not as an attack on academic exchange, but as a defence of ethical scholarship. So despite their growing significance, academic boycotts remain underreported in mainstream media, though. Western governments hostile to BDS have helped create a political climate in which supporting academic boycotts is framed as anti-Semitic or extremist, because of course it is. Universities themselves often choose not to publicise their decisions to avoid donor backlash or political controversy, framing them instead as technical, ethical reviews. Mainstream media outlets tend to relegate such stories to campus news events, missing their broader geopolitical implications. And yet the precedent for that has been set a long time ago. Yet the lack of media coverage does not diminish the power being wielded here. As PACB has noted, academic boycotts are designed to grow incrementally, building moral consensus over time. The Florence decision may not have been headline news worldwide, but within academic networks, it's been hailed as a historic victory and an example to emulate, as it has emulated other universities doing likewise before it. The academic boycott of Israel closely mirrors the anti-apartheid academic boycotts of South Africa. In the 70s and 80s, universities initially resisted boycotts. They cited academic freedom then too, but eventually they capitulated to the moral and political pressure. These boycotts helped isolate South Africa diplomatically by signalling to governments that the apartheid regime had lost the moral backing of the world's intellectual elite. PACB explicitly models its strategy on this precedent, aiming to create the same snowball effect. The question now is how far and how fast this intellectual revolt will spread. If more elite institutions such as Harvard or Oxford or the Sorbonne were to adopt similar measures, and there have been difficulties there, notably with the Sorbonne, Israel could face full-scale academic isolation in time, perhaps within the next decade. The long-term consequences could extend beyond academia, influencing political decision-making, trade relationships, and even arms embargoes. I hope it happens a lot more swiftly than the next decade, though. I want to see this accelerate. The University of Florence's decision to cut ties with Israeli academic institutions is not an isolated or symbolic act. It's part of a global academic revolt that is steadily eroding Israel's soft power and undermining its carefully cultivated narratives of democracy and innovation. By exposing the complicity of Israeli universities in military occupation and human rights violations, Academic boycotts are reframing Israel's international image from a celebrated hub of scientific progress to a pariah state increasingly compared to apartheid South Africa, and rightly so. So Israel's alarm is rather telling. Governments and universities do not devote millions to fighting a threat they consider insignificant. Academic boycotts matter because they carry moral authority. They shape future political elites. They build the kind of long-term pressure that once helped bring down South Africa's apartheid regime. Florence may well be remembered as a turning point, the moment when Europe's intellectual elite began to openly challenge Israel's legitimacy. The question is no longer whether academic boycotts will grow, but whether Israel can withstand the moral and intellectual isolation that follows when the world's universities decide it is no longer worthy of their partnership, especially as they show absolutely zero sign of changing course from what they are doing. Academic boycotts outside Israel are one thing, but boycotts within Israel are quite another, and one is causing Israel some particularly painful optics right now. The Ben Gurion International Airport has been shut down once more, though not this time by the Houthis, but by their own baggage handlers instead. As Netanyahu spends more and more on his numerous war fronts, you see, there's less and less pay to pay the wages of state-funded workers, and the state-funded airport is cracking up as a result. Get all the details of that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping support the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated. Holding power to account for ordinary working class people. I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.